the sun that rose over the Kursk salient on the morning of July 5, 1943, illuminated a landscape that had been transformed into the most heavily fortified kill zone in the history of warfare. The air was thick with the humidity of the Russian summer and the acrid pre-battle stench of diesel fumes, unburnt propellant, and the sweat of 2 million men waiting to die. On the northern shoulder of this salient, facing the entrenched Soviet 13th Army near the railway station of Ponyri, the German Wehrmacht was preparing to unleash a weapon of such singular, terrifying magnitude that it defied the established logic of armored warfare. It was a machine born of desperation and technological megalomania, a vehicle so massive that it shook the earth with a seismic tremor simply by idling its engines. This was the Panzerjäger Tiger P, known to the troops as the Ferdinand. Weighing in at a crushing 65 metric tons, the Ferdinand was not merely a tank, it was a mobile geological feature. Its frontal armor was a solid slab of face-hardened steel 200 millimeters thick, a dimension of protection that rendered it mathematically invulnerable to every anti-tank gun, field gun, and tank destroyer in the Soviet arsenal. The crew of 6, sealed inside this hermetic steel box, felt a profound, intoxicating sense of godhood. They were the vanguard of Schwere Panzerjägerabteilung 654, the heavy anti-tank battalion chosen to spearhead the assault. As they looked through their thick, armored glass vision blocks, they saw a battlefield that could not hurt them. They were piloting the ultimate fortress. The operational doctrine was simple, brutal, and seemingly flawless. The Ferdinands would advance in a Panzerkeil wedge formation, halting at ranges of 2 to 3 kilometers to utilize their primary weapon, the 82mm Pak 43-2L71. This gun was a masterpiece of ballistics, capable of accelerating a tungsten cord projectile to supersonic speeds that could punch through a T-34 tank as if it were made of wet cardboard, long before the Soviet crew even knew they were under attack. The Ferdinand was designed to be a sniper of giants, a machine that killed from beyond the horizon, impervious to retribution. The psychological impact on the Soviet defenders was expected to be catastrophic. How do you fight a machine that simply ignores your heaviest weapons? However, as the behemoths lurched forward, crushing barbed wire and tank traps under their wide tracks, a subtle, horrifying reality began to dawn on the commanders. The sheer weight of the Ferdinands turned the dry steppe into a churning dust cloud that blinded the supporting infantry. The artillery barrages separated the soft targets from the hard targets. Within hours, the Ferdinands found themselves isolated, pushing deep into the labyrinth of Soviet trench lines, stripped of their infantry support. It was here, in the claustrophobic chaos of the trench network, that the ultimate fortress revealed its fatal, amateurish flaw. The Soviet infantrymen, initially terrified by the monsters that shrugged off direct hits from 76mm shells, realized something impossible. They watched the steel giants rumble past. They waited, and then they stood up. The Soviet soldiers realized that the god of steel was blind, and more critically, it was toothless. The Ferdinand, designed by the genius Ferdinand Porsche, had no machine gun. There was no port in the hull to sweep the ground before it. There was no coaxial gun next to the massive cannon to suppress the infantry. The beast could kill a tank 3 miles away, but it could not kill a man standing 3 meters away. Emboldened by this realization, Soviet tank hunter squads swarmed the vehicles. They did not use high-tech weaponry. They used the tools of the Dark Ages. They climbed onto the engine decks. They smashed the vision blocks with sledgehammers, blinding the drivers. They poured incendiary fluid into the ventilation grates. The crews inside, screaming over the intercoms, realized with dawning horror that their 200 millimeters of armor was useless against a man with a hammer and a bottle of gasoline. The ultimate fortress had become a steel coffin. To understand the catastrophic failure of the Ferdinand at Kursk, one must perform a forensic autopsy of the engineering culture that birthed it. The vehicle was not created by military necessity alone. It was the bastard child of industrial arrogance and political corruption. Its father was Professor Ferdinand Porsche, the automotive genius behind the Volkswagen Beetle and a personal favorite of Adolf Hitler. In 1942, the Third Reich was seeking a new heavy tank to counter the Soviet threat. Two firms, Henschel and Porsche, were invited to submit designs for what would become the Tiger of Fur. Professor Porsche, driven by supreme confidence and his close relationship with the Führer, did not wait for the military trials to conclude. In a gamble of staggering industrial hubris, he ordered the Nibelungenwerke factory in Austria to begin the immediate production of 90 chassis for his proposed Tiger P. He assumed his design would win. He assumed his genius was infallible. But his design was radical, complex, and fundamentally flawed. Instead of a standard mechanical transmission, Porsche utilized a petrol-electric hybrid drive. Two gasoline engines powered electric generators, which in turn drove electric motors connected to the tracks. It was a visionary concept, decades ahead of its time. But in the material reality of 1942, Germany, it was a disaster. The system required vast amounts of copper, a strategic resource Germany critically lacked. The air-cooled engines were prone to catastrophic overheating. The drivetrain was heavy, complex, and nearly impossible to repair in the field. When the Wehrmacht tested the Porsche Tiger against the Henschel Tiger, the verdict was brutal. The Porsche tank sank in the mud. It caught fire. It was rejected. The contract went to Henschel. Porsche was left with 90 completed heavy tank hulls, 90 monuments to his own ego, representing millions of Reichsmarks and thousands of tons of precious steel sitting uselessly in a factory yard. In any rational military system, these hulls would have been scrapped. But in the Nazi hierarchy, personal connections outweighed tactical logic. Hitler, unwilling to see his favorite engineer humiliated, intervened. He ordered that the 90 failed Tiger hulls be repurposed. They would not be tanks. They would be converted into the ultimate Panzerjäger, tank hunter. The conversion process was a frantic, rushed affair. To compensate for the chassis' failures, the engineers doubled down on armor. They bolted an additional 100 mm plates of steel onto the front, bringing the total to 200 mm. They moved the engines to the middle of the hull and built a massive, fixed casemate at the rear to house the immense 80 mm 43 gun. In their obsession with creating a long-range sniper, the engineers succumbed to tunnel vision. They looked at the ballistics tables and the armor penetration charts, but they forgot the battlefield. The omission of the hull machine gun was not an oversight. It was a conscious design choice based on a flawed doctrine. They believed the Ferdinand would always fight from a distance, supported by lesser tanks. They did not design a weapon for war. They designed a weapon for a shooting range. This intellectual arrogance, the belief that technology could dictate the terms of battle, was welded into every plate of the Ferdinand, sealing the fate of the crews who would take it into the meat grinder of Kursk. The heart of the Ferdinand was as radical as its armor was thick, and it was the source of endless misery for its crews. Unlike standard tanks that used a gearbox and transmission to drive the tracks, the Ferdinand used a petrol-electric drive. Two Maybach HL 120 TRM gasoline engines powered two Siemens Schuckert electric generators. These generators, in turn, sent power to two electric motors mounted in the rear of the hull, which drove the sprockets. The theory was elegant. It eliminated the need for a heavy, complex mechanical transmission, which would likely shatter under the 65-ton weight of the vehicle. It allowed for smooth acceleration and simplified steering. In practice, however, it was a maintenance nightmare. The system operated at high voltage and generated immense heat. The engines had to run at high RPMs constantly to generate sufficient current, leading to chronic thermal stress. The cooling system, a complex network of fans and radiators, was insufficient for the Russian summer. Furthermore, the entire drivetrain was housed deep within the hull, making field repairs nearly impossible. If a generator failed, the crew essentially had to dismantle the entire fighting compartment to reach it. The sheer weight of the vehicle meant that the power-to-weight ratio was abysmal. The Ferdinand had a top speed of only 30 km/h on roads and crawled at a snail's pace off-road. Its fuel consumption was astronomical. But the most critical tactical flaw was its immobility in difficult terrain. If the Ferdinand bogged down or lost power, it could not be towed by standard recovery vehicles. It required the combined pulling power of 5 18-ton recovery half-tracks to move one dead Ferdinand. This maneuver was complex, dangerous, and virtually impossible to execute under enemy fire. This logistical reality dictated a grim operational truth to the crews. There is no rescue. If the complex electric motors burned out, if the tracks snapped, or if the vehicle bogged down in a marsh, the tank was lost. The crew would have to set demolition charges to destroy the gun and the secret drive system, and then abandon the ultimate fortress. They were piloting machines that were essentially single-use assets. The psychological burden of this knowledge was immense. They knew that a simple blown fuse or a thrown track link was as lethal as a direct hit from a Soviet shell. The Ferdinand was fighting a war against its own weight and complexity before it ever saw a Russian soldier. The complexity of the drive system also meant that the vehicle was incredibly loud. The whine of the electric motors and the roar of the gas engines created a unique acoustic signature that alerted Soviet infantry to their approach long before they were seen. Stealth was impossible. The Ferdinand announced its arrival with the subtlety of a freight train, further compromising its role as a hidden sniper. The interior of the Ferdinand was a study in isolation. The crew of 6, commander, gunner, loader, driver, radio operator, and a second loader, were encased in a steel box that offered supreme protection but horrific visibility. The driver and radio operator sat in the front of the hull, separated from the rest of the crew in the rear superstructure by the hot, noisy engine compartment. Communication was possible only through intercoms, which frequently failed. The vision ports were thick blocks of armored glass designed to stop anti-tank rifle rounds, but offering a narrow, distorted field of view. Critically, the tank lacked a rotating cupola with periscopes for the commander, a standard feature on other German tanks like the Panzer IV and Tiger I, which allowed for 360-degree situational awareness. Instead, the commander had a simple hatch and fixed vision slits. When buttoned up for combat, the Ferdinand was effectively blind to anything happening within a 50-meter radius of its hull. There were massive blind spots to the sides and rear. This blindness was the direct result of the Hawk long-range doctrine. The engineers assumed the Ferdinand would always be supported by infantry or lighter tanks that would act as its eyes and ears. They did not anticipate the chaos of Kursk, where artillery barrages would separate the heavy armor from its support, leaving the blind giants alone in a sea of Soviet trenches. The isolation was not just external, it was internal. The sheer noise of the dual engines and the ventilation system made verbal communication impossible without the electronic intercom. If the intercom failed, the tank became a disjointed collection of men unable to coordinate their actions. The driver could not see what the commander saw. The gunner was focused on a tiny slice of the world through his telescopic sight. In the heat of battle, this sensory deprivation created a unique form of claustrophobic panic. The crews were fighting blind in a machine that was deaf to the battlefield around it. The most fatal flaw of the Ferdinand was not mechanical, but conceptual. In the frantic race to get these machines ready for the summer offensive, Porsche focused entirely on 2 metrics: armor thickness and gun caliber. The doctrine was simple. The Ferdinand would engage targets at extreme range, destroying Soviet armor long before the enemy could return fire. In this long-range sniper doctrine, there was no perceived need for close-in defense. Why waste weight and internal space on a hull machine gun if the enemy never gets within a kilometer? This singular focus on the sniper role blinded the design team to the chaotic reality of the Eastern Front, where battle lines were fluid and infantry swarms were a constant threat. The decision to omit a hull machine gun, a standard feature on virtually every other tank in World War II, was not an accident. It was a deliberate design choice born of hubris. The radio operator, sitting next to the driver, had no weapon to fire. He was a passenger in a 65-ton target. The only anti-infantry weapon available was a single MG-34 machine gun kept loose inside the vehicle, which had to be fired through the open gun breech or a tiny rear hatch, a suicidal proposition in the midst of a firefight. This left the Ferdinand completely defenseless against infantry, who managed to close the distance, a tactical oversight that would be ruthlessly exploited by the Soviet defenders at Ponyri. The lack of a machine gun transformed the Ferdinand from a dominant predator into a vulnerable prey, forcing the crew to watch helplessly as the enemy swarmed their invincible fortress. The operational debut of the Ferdinand on the morning of July 5, 1943, was a spectacle of terrifying, raw power. The 654th Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion, deploying 44 of these monsters, spearheaded the assault against the intricate Soviet defensive belts surrounding the railway station of Ponyri. This location was the linchpin of the northern shoulder of the Kursk salient, a position the Soviets had turned into a fortress of trenches, bunkers, and buried armor. As the Ferdinands lurched out of their assembly areas, the ground shook. The initial engagement ranges were ideal for the 80 mm Pak 43-2. German gunners, peering through their SFL ZF-1A sights, began identifying Soviet T-34s and anti-tank gun emplacements at distances of over 2,500 meters. The result was a massacre of Soviet armor. The high-velocity tungsten-cored shells bridged the gap in seconds, tearing turrets off T-34s and vaporizing 76mm gun crews before they could even determine the source of the fire. To the German crews, the first hour of Operation Citadel felt like a vindication of Porsche's vision. However, as the Ferdinands advanced, closing the distance to the first line of Soviet trenches, the dynamics of the battle began to shift. The Soviet artillery response was cataclysmic. Thousands of heavy shells churned the earth, creating a landscape of craters and soft, pulverized soil. The 65-ton Ferdinands, already struggling with a low power-to-weight ratio, found their mobility drastically reduced. They did not drive. They waded through the earth. More critically, the intense Soviet barrage successfully stripped away the supporting German infantry and lighter Panzer III and Ivory tanks. The lighter vehicles and grenadiers were forced to take cover or were destroyed, leaving the Ferdinands to push forward alone. This separation of forces, the isolation of the heavy armor from its protective screen, was the critical tactical error that the Soviet commanders had been waiting for. The Ferdinands were now blind giants, stumbling into a trap designed specifically for them. They crossed the first trench line, crushing defenders beneath their tracks. But in doing so, they entered a kill zone where long-range optics were useless and invulnerable frontal armor was irrelevant. They had entered the domain of the Soviet infantrymen. As the isolated Ferdinands rumbled deep into the defensive zone, the Soviet infantry did not retreat. They had been drilled in tank fear discipline. They knew that running meant death. Instead, they waited in their spider holes and deep trenches until the steel monsters passed directly over them or rolled past their flanks. Once the Ferdinand exposed its rear or side, the Soviet soldiers emerged. This was the moment the conceptual flaw of the Ferdinand became a fatal reality. The German radio operator, sitting in the hull, looked out through his vision block and saw enemies running alongside the tank, but he had no machine gun to engage them. He was a spectator to his own execution. The commander, peering through his hatch slits, could see the swarms of infantry closing in, but without a rotating cupola or a coaxial machine gun, he could not bring any weapon to bear without turning the entire 65-ton vehicle, a maneuver that was agonizingly slow with the petrol-electric drive. The Soviet tactics were primitive, brutal, and devastatingly effective. They exploited the Ferdinand's blind spots with ruthless efficiency. Squads of tank hunters approached from the rear dead zone, climbing onto the engine decks while the vehicle was still moving. The crew inside could hear the terrifying sound of boots clattering on the steel roof above their heads. They were sealed inside a fortress that had been boarded by the enemy. Inside, panic began to set in. The loader grabbed the single MP-40 submachine gun available to the crew and attempted to fire through the small ammunition loading hatch in the rear. But this offered a negligible field of fire and exposed him to sniper fire. The ultimate fortress was being overwhelmed not by superior technology, but by the sheer courage of men who realized the giant had no teeth. The destruction of the Ferdinands at Poniri involved a dismantling process that was almost industrial in its intimacy. Soviet soldiers utilized weapons that cost a fraction of a Reichsmark to destroy machines worth millions. The most iconic and humiliating tool was the Molotov cocktail. The Ferdinand's engine deck, located in the center of the hull, featured large ventilation grates necessary to cool the overworked gasoline engines and electric generators. These grates were the tank's lungs, and they were wide open. Soviet soldiers smashed bottles of thickened gasoline directly onto these grates. The flaming liquid seeped instantly into the engine compartment, igniting oil lines, rubber hoses, and electrical insulation. Inside, the crew was choked by acrid smoke and the terrifying roar of an engine fire. The automatic fire suppression systems were often overwhelmed, but the most psychological weapon was the sledgehammer and the crowbar. Soviet infantry, realizing they could not penetrate the armor, targeted the eyes of the beast. Brave soldiers climbed onto the frontal glasses and used heavy hammers to smash the thick, armored glass of the driver's vision block. Others targeted the periscopic gun sight. In seconds, the crew was literally blinded. A blinded 65-ton tank in a minefield is a dead tank. Other soldiers used crowbars to wedge into the drive sprockets or between the road wheels, hoping to throw a track or jam the running gear. Anti-tank rifles, useless against the 200mm main armor, were fired point-blank into the vision slits, sending razor-sharp spall, metal fragments, ricocheting around the crew compartment, wounding the men inside. The Ferdinand was not being destroyed. It was being tormented, blinded, and suffocated by a swarm it could not brush off. Compounding the infantry assault was the density of the Soviet minefields, which were laid with a specific understanding of heavy German armor. The Ferdinand's immense weight worked against it. Standard anti-tank mines, designed to break the track of a 30-ton Panzer IV, caused catastrophic damage to the complex Porsche longitudinal torsion bar suspension of the 65-ton Ferdinand. The sheer ground pressure of the beast also triggered deep-buried heavy mines, clusters of explosives stacked together, that lighter tanks might have passed over without detonating. When a Ferdinand hit a mine, the damage was rarely a simple track break. The explosion often shattered the complex bogie wheels and twisted the suspension arms, rendering field repair impossible. Unlike a standard tank, which could be towed to the rear for repair under cover of darkness, a disabled Ferdinand was a permanent loss. The Wehrmacht possessed no recovery vehicle capable of moving a dead Ferdinand on the soft Russian soil. It required 5 18-ton heavy half-tracks, FAMO, harnessed together to move one Ferdinand, a logistical circus that was impossible to organize under heavy Soviet artillery fire. Thus, a simple mine, costing a few rubles, achieved a mobility kill on a strategic asset. Once immobilized, the Ferdinand became a static steel bunker. The crew could continue to fire the main gun, but they were now a fixed target for Soviet heavy artillery, 150mm howitzers, and Sturmovik attack aircraft, which pounded the stationary giants until their armor cracked or their crews went mad from the concussion. As the sun set over the burning steppes of Poniri, the fields were littered with the smoking hulks of the invincible Ferdinands. The tragedy for the Germans was that the majority of these losses were not due to enemy penetration of the frontal armor. They were mobility kills and abandonments. Crews, trapped in immobilized vehicles, blinded by hammers or choking from engine fires caused by Molotovs, faced the final, bitter decision: scuttling. They could not allow these secret weapons to fall into Soviet hands. The standing order was to destroy the gun and the drive system. The crews placed demolition charges in the breech of the 88mm gun and on the delicate electric generators. With a heavy heart, they triggered the fuses and bailed out into the night, joining the retreat on foot, leaving behind their 65-ton fortresses. The sight of these massive, undamaged machines, blowing themselves up from the inside, was the ultimate symbol of the Ferdinand's failure. It was a weapon defeated by its own design philosophy. Of the 89 Ferdinands committed to the battle, nearly half were lost in the first few days of operations. They had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks, but they had failed to achieve the breakthrough, stopped cold by mines, mud, and men with bottles of gasoline. The ultimate fortress had fallen. Not to a bigger fortress, but to the relentless friction of real war. By the autumn of 1943, the surviving Ferdinands, approximately 48 battered hulls, were withdrawn from the Eastern Front and transported back to the Nibelungenwerke factory in Austria. The return of these vehicles was not a triumphant homecoming. It was a forensic engineering emergency. The damage reports from the crews were unanimous and scathing. They demanded visibility, they demanded mobility, but above all, they demanded the ability to kill infantry. The resulting refit program was comprehensive, transforming the vehicle into a new variant officially designated the Elephant. This upgrade was, in essence, a multi-million Reichsmark admission of guilt by the Porsche design team. The most critical modification was the installation of a bow machine gun. A rectangular section of the 200mm frontal armor was cut away, an immensely difficult metallurgical task, to install a Kugelblende 50 ball mount for an MG-34 machine gun. For the first time, the radio operator was given a weapon. He could now sweep the area directly in front of the tank, preventing the hammer and Molotov attacks that had decimated the unit at Poniri. To address the commander's blindness, a Panzer III assault gun cupola with 7 periscopes was welded onto the roof, finally granting 360-degree situational awareness without opening the hatch. The upgrades also addressed the unseen enemies. The engine grates, previously wide open to incendiary liquids, were redesigned with armored covers and finer mesh to prevent Molotov cocktails from reaching the gasoline engines. The entire hull was coated in Zimmerit, a rough cement-like paste designed to prevent magnetic anti-tank mines from adhering to the steel, a direct response to the close-quarters trauma of Kursk. The tracks were widened slightly to decrease ground pressure. The Elephant was a significantly more survivable machine than the Ferdinand. It was the tank that should have been built in 1942, but the engineers could not fix the fatal heart of the beast. The petrol-electric drive and the crushing 65-ton weight remained unchanged. They had polished the armor, but the skeleton underneath was still brittle. In early 1944, the first company of the newly christened Elephants was deployed to the Italian front to stem the Allied advance at Anzio. This deployment decision remains one of the most baffling strategic blunders of the German High Command. While the Elephant was designed for the wide flat steppes of Russia, where its long-range gun could dominate, Italy was a nightmare of narrow mountain roads, steep gradients, and ancient stone bridges. The terrain itself became a weapon against the Porsche drive system. The petrol-electric transmission, already prone to overheating, was pushed to its breaking point by the Italian geography. Climbing steep mountain passes required the electric motors to operate at maximum torque for extended periods. The cooling fans, unable to cope with the load in the Mediterranean climate, failed. Motors burned out with alarming frequency, leaving the 65-ton vehicles immobilized on single-lane mountain tracks, effectively blocking the retreat for entire German columns behind them. But the ultimate enemy in Italy was the bridge. Italian infrastructure was not built to support 65 metric tons. Standard stone arch bridges would groan and shatter under the elephant's concentrated load. This forced the units to seek lengthy detours or attempt dangerous river fordings. In one documented incident, an elephant attempted to cross a reinforced bridge, only to have the structure collapse mid-crossing, dropping the tank into the ravine below. The crew survived, but the vehicle was a total loss. The psychological impact on the commanders was immense. They were tethered to a map of safe bridges, their tactical mobility dictated entirely by civil engineering limits. The elephant was the most powerful tank in Italy, but it was trapped in a cage of geography, unable to maneuver to the decisive points of the battle. In Russia, the main threat had been mines and infantry. In Italy, the elephant faced a new nemesis, the Allied fighter bomber. The U.S. Army Air Force and the RAF dominated the skies. The slow-moving, massive elephants, struggling up mountain roads at 10-kilometer range, were perfect targets for P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoon fighter bombers armed with rockets. The elephant's roof armor, while thickened, could not withstand a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb or a barrage of high-velocity rockets. The crews adopted a life of troglodytes, moving only at night and hiding in tunnels or dense camouflage during the day. When forced to fight, they were terrifyingly effective. At Anzio, entrenched elephants destroyed American Sherman tanks at ranges where the American crews couldn't even identify the muzzle flash. But as soon as the Allied line flanked them, a simple maneuver against such a static enemy, the elephants were forced to retreat. And a retreating elephant was a dying elephant. As fuel supplies dwindled and spare parts for the complex electric motors vanished, crews began the heartbreaking ritual of self-destruction. They would drain the remaining fuel, set charges in the breech and engine bay, and blow up their own machines to prevent capture. The road to Rome was lined with the burning carcasses of the ultimate fortress, destroyed not by enemy fire, but by the logistical impossibility of keeping them alive. By April 1945, the Third Reich had shrunk to the size of a city. The remnants of the heavy tank hunter companies had been ground to dust. However, 2 surviving elephants, battered veterans of the Eastern Front, were operational at the Kummersdorf proving grounds and were hastily mobilized to defend the OKH headquarters at Zossen, just south of Berlin. This final chapter was the ultimate inversion of the tank's design philosophy. A vehicle built to kill targets at 3 kilometers across open plains was now forced to fight in the rubble-choked, claustrophobic streets of the burning capital. The final combat actions of these last 2 elephants are shrouded in the chaos of the collapse, but Soviet reports indicate they were used as mobile pillboxes at key intersections. In this environment, the lack of a turret was a fatal liability. To engage a Soviet T-34 appearing down a side street, the driver had to rotate the entire 65-ton vehicle within the confines of a ruined avenue. The electric motors, starved of maintenance and running on bad fuel, screamed in protest. The Soviet tanks, agile and numerous, simply drove around the block and shot the elephants in the rear engine grates. The last operational elephant was captured by the Red Army near the Karl August Platz in Berlin. It had been abandoned by its crew after running out of ammunition and fuel. It stood silent amidst the ruins, a massive gray ghost covered in brick dust. The Soviets towed it away, a trophy of the beast killer that had terrified them at Kursk, now reduced to a piece of roadside junk in the heart of the defeated Reich. It was the ignominious end to Ferdinand Porsche's dream of the invincible tank. The after-action report on the Panzerjäger Tiger, P, offers a definitive and damning verdict on the philosophy of Wunderwaffen. The Ferdinand Elephant was a tactical failure born of strategic delusion. It was an engineering masterpiece in a vacuum, but a disaster in the ecosystem of war. The engineering flaw. The choice of the petrol-electric drive was visionary but premature. It added weight, complexity, and a dependency on strategic copper that Germany could not afford. It created a vehicle that required a logistical tail larger than the combat unit itself. The tactical flaw. The initial omission of the machine gun remains the textbook example of tunnel vision in military design. By focusing exclusively on the hard threat, tanks, Porsche ignored the soft threat, infantry, creating a fatal vulnerability that cost dozens of vehicles and crews. The strategic flaw. The Ferdinand consumed resources, steel, fuel, rare alloys, and manufacturing time that could have produced hundreds of Jagdpanther or Stu-G3 destroyers. These lighter, simpler vehicles were versatile, reliable, and effective. The Ferdinand was a resource sink that accelerated Germany's defeat. The legacy of the Ferdinand is found today in the Kubinka Tank Museum in Russia and the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum. They stand as massive, silent warnings to future engineers. They prove that on the battlefield, mobility often trumps armor, reliability always trumps complexity, and arrogance is a flaw that no amount of steel can protect against. The ultimate fortress was not destroyed by a bigger gun. It was dismantled by the friction of war and the hammers of determined infantry. This is the enduring lesson of the Ferdinand. Invincibility is an illusion.